regarding timekeeping, but also in deference to the cocktail hour. We don't want to impede on it too much, especially for those of you who have to scurry off to your office or home at the conclusion. Just a reminder, I think I'll call it Slido instead of Slido. For those of you who are shy and don't like to pose questions, please use Slido if you would like to comment or query the panel. Our next panel is, the discussion topic is the path to net zero. We have Mia Ehla, who we heard from earlier from Deltamarin. We have Rasmus Elborg Jensen, the CEO and founder of ReFlow, and Andreas Christostomou, the director of the Clean Shipping Alliance. Since we don't have movies this time, I'm going to ask each of them to make a brief opening statement from their perspective about the path to net zero, and we'll pick up from there with the panel and the discussion on the floor. Thank you.
You can hear me now. Great. Very briefly, I can summarize. It's a long way to Tipperary. The path to net zero. It's a long discussion, long implementation, and long time frame. Although the regulators, they want to shorten it to 2030 and maximum to 2050. My comments have to be brief, and I will take it that discussion is. I believe the only way to achieve that is when we know what we want to achieve, how we want to achieve it, and how we collaborate to do it all together. It's not, let's call it a battle that cannot be fought by few. It's a battle that has to be fought by everybody, the owners, the operators, the suppliers, the logistic chains, and whatever else is influencing our industry. But let's get into it when we get into the full discussion.
Yeah, okay, I already, in the presentation, I discussed all about the technical ways how to reach, let's say, net zero. So it's about the energy saving and the digitalisation and the electrification and of course the alternative fuels. But I think really like how to, anyway, the idea, the point of all this is that actually there's a need to reduce the emissions. So in that perspective, it's to me like really a lot about what was actually discussed in the last panel, that how can we, when we do one improvement, how can we really actually measure that it works? And it's also about when we install this new technology on board vessels, whether it's a new building or retrofit. So it's also, of course, a lot about getting the crew to actually be able to operate it and making the most of it, because this is not either easy. So to me, it's really about this learning curve and also then documenting, basically testing one by one, how much savings do we get, and in that way, kind of building basically that those let's say processes that actually work and what is the actual benefits, and in that sense, it's really like it's not only the technical kind of dimension, but it's really also the social aspect as well. Okay, more later.
Oh, thank you. My name is Rasmus. I'm representing a company called ReFlow. At ReFlow, we are probably right now one of the leading companies in the world within life cycle assessment on vessels. And then you might ask yourself, why can a company actually exist doing life cycle assessments when it's not a real compliance thing yet? And I think that the question that I want to bring in is that we're talking about net zero. This discussion, this panel is net zero. We're seeing ship owners that are committing to net zero goals. We're seeing their customers committing to net zero goals. But in the shipping industry, we are not even calculating in these absolute terms yet. So how can we actually make a change if we are not measuring it? And today we are measuring in CI, SEMP, EXI, and so on and so on. But the end result is an absolute number. It's a number that can be measured, but we're not measuring it yet. And I think one of the thought-provoking thoughts here is, okay, let's do a scenario where we add green fuel to our vessel. How would that change the emission profile of the vessel? Well, in some of our work, we can see that today it's about 95% is old fuel, direct emissions. But if we add green fuel to the vessel, about 30% of the vessel, or 30% of the entire vessel life cycle emissions is going to be the vessel. So that means we need to focus on the vessel itself. We need to focus on the construction. We need to focus on how do we actually manage this as a ship owner. Because if we don't have an idea about these numbers and we are investing in batteries and fuel cells, and then suddenly we have to put a number on this, we don't know if that number is high or low or where we are. And a perfect example is a very large container shipping company recently adjusted their indirect emissions for their operations with 20% up, because now they're measuring actual emissions, means the fleet of their vessels. They're not estimating anymore. So if that's the fact, and as a ship owner you are looking at some numbers in your sustainability reporting, but then at the end of the goal it might be 30% more, and you have no idea, and you have these commitments. So that's some of the discussion I would like to bring up today. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And once again, as I mentioned earlier, you can't discuss these topics individually. They all just sort of run together. So some of what we had listed as how we would promote this discussion has already been part of the discussion. That doesn't mean we're not going to pick up on it again, because some of the points made and some of the challenges raised are the real meat of the matter of why we're here. And I think the idea of net zero in and of itself is one of those things that is really subjective, and it's really nebulous. It's a really ambitious, nice thing to say. It looks great in the press. It looks marvelous when we're reporting back to our internal ESG overlords. I mean, we have to have it as part of the discussion. But what does it really mean? Is it actually achievable in our industry? And we start talking, we get into the fuel conversation first, and we start talking about these green future fuels. But at the same time, like Mia pointed out earlier, if we're making hydrogen and using fossil fuel to create the electricity, to do the electrolysis, what is the actual gain? We can't just measure one piece of it, and as we start to talk about the life cycle assessment, we're trying to incorporate that, but we really don't have enough information yet to make meaningful calculations for a lot of the fuels and the ambitions that we have built into the net zero discussion. So the first question that I would like to throw out to the room is, relative to, again, going back to the regulatory discussion. We have, as an industry, we have a tendency to have a wait and see policy. And you mentioned first movers earlier, and the ambition of first movers, the responsibility of it, and what the missing pieces are. I haven't seen any particularly compelling regulatory incentives for first movers. And there are some financial incentives that are being proposed within the EU and what have you. But what do you think from a regulatory standpoint? And you have a say in this, right? We all have a say in it. What do you think is the missing piece? What do you think will get us off of this wait and see? Is it going to be a regulatory imposition? We talked about it a little bit earlier. Or is there something else that we're missing here that's going to drive us to net zero? Do we have to wait for regulation? Or is there some other factor that we can calculate into this and act on now? And I would ask any of the panelists to comment, and I would like comments from the floor. Go ahead, please.
There are three pillars on your question for me. The one is the regulator itself, then is the industry, and then is society. Society has to agree with the regulator if they're going to give you incentives that the taxpayer will pay in. They have to chip in, because the only way to have that is by subsidization, or by what you call national aid, state aid, as we call it in Europe. So society and regulator, they have to be in concord to say that, listen, some of your tax money, they will go for this. Now, what kind of incentive are you going to give? Are you going to give the industry a few dollars just to buy an equipment that costs billions of dollars? So I don't think there is a way the regulator can give any incentive, which is money-wise. The incentive is exactly what's been said. I'm experimenting. I'm the one doing it early in the business. Don't come and penalize me because at the end your regulation will look blue and then suddenly turn out to be black. And that we've seen it many times before. One good example is start putting the horses in front of the coaches. We had that with the Ballast Water Management Convention containing inside dates that they would never came into force, and then we ran to find what I call innovative international regulations or law to change it. Now we see, at least in this time, the IMO followed the UNFCCC idea. We have goals and aspirations. Everything that you have in regulation today is simply operational and is simply technical. We haven't seen anything coming in which is an incentive for the industry to change culture. Do we need to do that? My answer is no. You don't need a regulation to impose levy or impose cap and trade. You can do it yourself. So I think we have, you said it very rightly, it's a revolution, and the revolution is done by those that are not actually participating in the actual battle. So it's done by people outside. But again, it's been a habit in the maritime industry that we have regulations. I mean, you have to know that we are the only industry in the world that we have international regulations regulating CO2s on board ships. I mean, the EEDI, when it came in force in 2011, well, adopted in 2011, definitely it was the only industry that had that. If you don't agree with me that you don't need regulation, you need regulation, then we need innovative ideas. And I don't think habit trade is the solution. I would have preferred a levy, so you know exactly what you're doing and you know what to pay. And then we need a policeman to make sure that the money collected in that pot are used for the right purpose. But I will quote an old professor from MIT who said 2050, we're still going to be depending on something called fossil fuel.
Honestly, I think it's a very good point, and I think we're in the maritime industry is normally been dependent on other people telling us what to do and having compliance instead of being proactive. What we can see right now with some of our customers, ship owners, is that there are actually some markets right now where we are seeing market demand from customer side, pulling environmental actions into a competitive space for the ship owners. And of course, we can all see that some of the big container shipping companies are really investing heavily in this. But we can also see the ferry segment with passenger traffic. So all the areas that are close to the consumer will be affected first. And then another thing, we can see the EU is actually taking over the IMO on a regional basis, because with the new Corporate Sustainability Reporting Act that are being rolled out for the largest corporations on the fiscal year next year, but over the next 5 years for all European companies, you actually need to report on your emissions. So you need to report on also your indirect emissions, and that means also the emissions from the vessel itself, not just the fuel-related emissions. So from what we can see, this is going to be a game changer also for the ship owners, because this data will be publicly available. So now suddenly you'll be measured not just on your vessel and the performance, but also as a company. So that data also plays in as part of what we can see, the procurement decision data in the future. Like, who do you want to work with? And that's really something we're not really looking at in the maritime industry yet, but something we should be aware of, or at least know the risk.
So from the floor, comments, challenges. We're starting to see this play out like a lot of other scenarios where we're waiting, and the risk of waiting is you start to see unilateral regulations that maybe are in conflict with the global regulations. There's a big risk here. And where do we influence the process? And we're the ones that are going to be regulated here. We're the ones that this is being imposed on. What do you have to say about it? I mean, what do you think about the conflict between ETS schemes, EU MRV, and CII? There's some obvious conflicts here that are not going to be easy to address from an industry standpoint. I would really like to hear your thoughts.
I regret that I'm going to sound extremely skeptical about all these new schemes. Put it this way, with the EU ETS, it's a very simple calculation. Right now, there are incentives and rewards for using alternative green fuels. We did a very simple calculation. You can run, let's say, 10 tankers within EEA ports with HFO, and you have one tanker of the same size, let's say MR2s, all of them MR2s, running on 10% green methanol. Now, don't ask me where I'm going to find green methanol in the EU. It's a theoretical exercise. But one of the 11 tankers running 10% on green methanol will erase your carbon tax commitment in the ETS scheme for the other 10. There's the incentive. The problem is the supply chain. For every 10 conventional tankers, one with dual fuel methanol engine will mean you don't have to pay carbon tax for the other 10. Right now, there's another loophole in the regulations in case you didn't know it. So, you know, regulations is not the way to do it. We need to change culture. Culture has huge inertia, and as we all know in this industry, that's the biggest thing to overcome, the inertia that already exists in the industry. And I'm afraid that all these regulations will not have the desired outcome, which I assume is a greener planet with less emissions from all industries. That's not going to be achieved with these schemes. That's my personal opinion.
It does require a cultural shift, and that's one of our biggest challenges. Other comments, please.
I've just heard that the ETS is simple, but we still don't know who will pay for the ETS. Is it going to be the owner? Is it going to be the charterer? At the end of the day, it will be the society. So I don't consider ETS as simple. The politicians pushed IMO to take measures, and they started with the CII regulation, maybe 4 years ago from what I remember. Today, everybody is saying that the CII as it is cannot be implemented. And yesterday, BIMCO submitted a new charter party clause to discuss about the CII. I've heard also that there are no international regulations for other industries. There are many international regulations for many industries. The emissions from cars have been regulated for the past 40, 50 years. And it's serious. It is international. If you cannot import in the EU a car that is not complying with the EU regulations, then it is international. Okay. And by the way, the IMO regulations are not exactly international. It is up to the flag state, and it's 170 of them, some of them land-locked, who can have an opinion or do not have an opinion. Shipping companies. If Europe wants to push shipping companies out of Europe, this is very, very easy. 99.9% of the shipping companies today are not European companies. They are Liberian, they are registered in Bermuda, they are registered in a number of other countries. So it is up to Europe to try to get the shipping industry with them or push the shipping industry away, as they have been doing for the past 30 or so years. Norwegian ship owners were really big 20, 30 years ago. Today, it's Mr. Fredriksen who is resident in Cyprus. What else can I tell you? I mean, it's nice to look to things in a global way, but it is also nice to leave each industry to regulate themselves. The politicians should stay targets, and they should let each industry to decide from themselves. We started talking about decarbonization. I think the shipping industry reacted, and then we have a flood waves of new regulations that are coming before even discussing the self-implemented regulations. I think it's. I don't think we are going the right way. And let me ask about this. Let's say index, call it as you want, for the lifetime of a ship. Do we include the production of the ship in this index? We do. Do we have a similar index for cars? Do we?
Yes,
Okay.
it's been in effect
Good
for
to know.
15 years.
So electric cars are more environmentally friendly than
No.
whatever.
So
They're
the
not. Okay.
So the question with the electrical car now, because we're going to go off topic, right? But it's similar to also the designs we see with electrical vehicle or electrical vessels. It all depends on the design of the vessel, but more importantly, the electricity that is being used to actually power the vessel.
Yes.
And just
So
because you have electrical
my
vessel,
question is simple. Do the electric car producers today know what kind of energy is used to produce their cars?
yes, they do.
Because just to remind you that the energy mix for each country changes day by day by day by day. In Greece today is summer, or it will be summer, and we have 60-70% renewables energy mix, and winter time is 10%. So what kind of index do we have for electric cars?
So this kind of plays back into the fuel discussion, I think, in the end, and when we're starting to talk about life cycle assessments and what have you. And we really don't have information yet to really gauge the footprint of some of the fuels that are being proposed. We have plans and strategies for how to create new energy sources in order to produce those fuels, in order to qualify them as green. But the metric isn't evolved enough yet for us to really make some of those calculations. And I think one of the things when we talk about the cultural shift that we're missing quite often in the discussion is the bottom line is who's going to pay? Who's going to pay here? Are the ship owners going to pay? Are the charters going to pay? Are we back in a position, well, I'm paying, but you're the one getting the benefit when you're operating my ship? You know, that old paradigm is a conflict. And the real problem is we can't pass through costs for this ambitious revolutionary momentum that we're trying to create to the public. Because shame on us, we don't have a relationship with the consumer as a shipping industry. We prefer to operate behind the veil for so many years that this value proposition we have that we transport 90+% of the world's goods as a manufactured product or as a raw material, we're the only ones that know that. The average consumer in the world doesn't know the value proposition of shipping. And so we've created a barrier to be able to pass through costs to achieve some of these goals. And I think when we talk about a cultural shift, that's part of it, is we have to somehow or other start to understand that we need to brand ourselves with the population that will absorb those costs eventually, like they have through every other evolution and revolution to decarbonize industries or progress forward to a greener initiative and a greener planet. So once again, we're kind of in this quagmire here, right? We've got too many moving pieces to take one of them and isolate it and say that's how we're going to come to these conclusions and achieve this process and the ultimate responsibility that we're trying to accommodate. So, you know, what's the next step? What's the next practical step? If you were going to give me one initiative to undertake in the path to net zero now, understanding all this stuff that's going on that seem to be barriers, it's good to identify barriers. That helps us come up with solutions. So let's talk about one practical step. And I'd like somebody on the panel to tell me what the next truly practical step is, industry-wide, that'll help us make meaningful progress towards this end game. Anybody? Okay, then you can counteract whatever he says. Give me a second, let him answer.
Okay. That was not a popular answer over there. I think from my side, the answer is very clear. We need to become data-driven on our environmental efforts. because right now we are acting like we think this, we think that, and I think we need to get used to having the entire industry to become data-driven. We need to break down the barriers, and we need to start sharing climate data. I'm not talking about fuel, I'm talking about everything. We need to break down the silos where the yards are having a little black box where they do stuff and then they suddenly a ship appears. So the whole data thing, but this is also a talk we've had before. We had the data sharing talk with optimization. We had data talk in some of the other networks. So it's something we've heard before, and we're still not doing it. But we need to become data driven, and there is no easy silver bullet for that one.
Yeah, I can continue from that. So I think also that the data driven thing is actually one key item. Maybe now a little bit challenge your question, because this is now a practical example that I think that kind of we know actually already, of course, not on the like really atom level or 1% accuracy exactly, but we know quite well anyway how much these ships actually then consume fuel, because there's so much monitoring and in the main processes. But still, like, let's say when we design a new tanker or bulker, and we know that we want to have certain amount of fuel for it, so we know that actually we don't need in the operation at all as much fuel as we have the storage by far. So we have, and we still have a lot of margins in all systems. Of course, it's safety, so that is safety comes first. But it's not all about safety. It's also, I think, a little bit, to me, it seems that it's when you have a certain standard. That, you know, even though it would be nice to design a ship, for example, let's say LNG operated ship. So it would be nice to kind of design so that, you know, you have actually a little bit less fuel maybe than, but it seems that, you know, the kind of bigger the better the fuel tank is, so then the value is better kind of for the vessel. But like, is it like, do you think, are you actually ready to really optimize these ships to operation? What do you think? Because this is in all systems, not only, of course, but this is the big one, the fuel tank, but then all the engines, you don't need all those margins, but maybe after drinks.
John, your question was about what is the can you repeat the question? What?
So just a practical step, and I think
I think
in your world there's a very practical step.
I think from my point of view, I said it, is the industry maybe clustering itself and create few not counter regulations, not self-regulation, but at least provide the view what we think internally as industry. So at least when they discuss it in this international fora, whether they're regional, whether they're national, whether they're international, we hear us. Because from my experience in the international fora, we are reactive. Someone comes with a beautiful idea in their own mind, he brings it over, they belong to a big group of countries, so they have 23 votes, let's say 27, and then the organized ship owners associations or whatever they are, like the ones that are represented there, they try to have an input, but it's already done. I would have preferred that the industry creates something, and as I say, clustering-wise, maybe sector by sector or subgroup of a sector, so they can do it, and they preemptive those discussions well before, because otherwise we end up with these regulations. From my observation, they go on for years, and many of them that actually don't create any benefit, or they are actually maybe unsafe in some occasions, and you never know. That would be my practical way of thinking.
So I think this conversation is leading us back to the life cycle assessment piece of this, because ultimately that's going to be hanging over our heads. We're going to have to perform life cycle assessments. And what is the one fuel today that we can do a life cycle assessment for? What is it? We all know the answer.
Well, here at ReFlow, we have done several life cycle assessments on methanol and on ammonia. So for us, and also on electricity grids. So for us, it's not rocket science, and the methods are there, but there is no standards. And I think that's the idea. So the methods on how to do the assessment is there, but it's not the same standard. We have not adopted any standards to do the assessments of the fuel. So we might have a way of doing it in China, and we might have a way of doing it in Finland, but if we haven't aligned this. So I definitely think we should work towards a common understanding and a common standard of the fuels. And what we can see on the fuels is that we are moving emissions. So the current generation of e-fuels that we have been assessed, we see very little direct emissions, what's called scope 1, which everybody's measuring. But now we see suddenly something called scope 3, and that's all the emissions related to the supply chain of making the fuel. So suddenly we see a lot of operations at shore where we are capturing CO2 if it's methanol, and we see the electrical, the whole power to X thing, which is utopia right now because we don't have the setup to do it. And we can see that now we are gaining, I think 60% of the emissions being generated is actually ashore now and not at sea. So now we are moving our emissions somewhere else in the countryside. And that talks to the life cycle view of fuels. But it's also a change of mindset, because today when we look at fossil fuels, we're only accounting for the direct emissions. We're not accounting for the refineries. We're not accounting for the supply chain with the tanker vessels, etc., etc., etc. So we also need to change the whole way of looking at this. And that's where the battle is right now.
From next year, all the bunker receipts, they should stay what is the carbon signature for producing the fuel. So this is already done.
And it's a good step.
Other thoughts on this subject? So, I'm going to make a statement. Won't be popular. I'm an advocate for burning HFO, personally. I'll probably get clubbed over the back of the head by somebody from Friends of the Earth one day when I leave one of these venues when I make that statement. But I honestly believe that for the next generation of ships, this one, and probably most of the next one, it's still going to be the principal fuel that we're all going to depend on. Either HFO or distillates, fossil fuel. And part of the missing piece there is improving scrubber technology, continuing to invest in scrubber technology to optimize it. The eventualities, I know we have some naysayers in the room about the reality of carbon capture being effective, manageable, a reality. It isn't today, but that doesn't mean it won't be. And that doesn't mean that continued investment in that direction isn't going to be a big part of the puzzle. Because when we're talking about a life cycle assessment, we know everything about the supply chain for fossil fuels, and especially for HFO. And we can calculate that right now, very precisely what the life cycle of that fuel is. And we know that it's available in every port and by every bunker that we've ever depended on for it. So I would like some thoughts about your position. You're the guys that are burning fuel. You're the guys that are trying to decide whether or not you're going to change engines to something that we don't know enough about yet in many cases to base those decisions. What are your thoughts on the continued use of burning HFO with abatement and eventually carbon capture versus adopting a new fuel? Where's that boundary for you? And do you see a boundary and or a transition point where the public perception will be so strong that you have to do it regardless of what we know and what we can do in terms of abatement? Question, comments?
We started talking about emission reductions in 2010, 2011. And the target was 30%, 40%, 50%, 70%, nobody knew. Suddenly we realized that by 2050 we cannot be carbon free. The politicians realized. And now we start talking about carbon capture, which is a completely new technology. Everybody is working on it. It will increase the amount of CO2 in the same way as scrubbers do. You mentioned scrubbers. For tankers, for big tankers, you spend 3 tons of fuel per day to send the water up to the scrubber. So 10 more. Yeah, 10 more tons of CO2 per day to have a scrubber. So my personal view, we should look at emissions and the climate in a global way. Not everybody to say, this is what I think, this is what I think, this is what I think, and the politicians to adopt it. And do you remember in the 1970s, after the Chernobyl, everybody, including myself, we were wearing a yellow sticker, nuclear power, no thanks. Okay, and 50 years later, we are talking again about nuclear power. And there is today, as we speak, there is a barge in the US with an old technology reactor, PWR reactor, producing hydrogen. So, we have to look at things long term, not what is happening tomorrow. That's my personal view. I don't know if I am right or wrong.
That's why we're here, to express our personal views and challenge each other. You know, sometimes I say things just to try to rile you up, because, you know, we need to talk about this stuff. That's why we came here today. And just listening to these guys doesn't answer all of our questions. Sometimes we have to air out our laundry a little bit. Sorry, Rasmus, go ahead.
May I make a short comment to the fossil fuel thing, because I tend not to agree, right?
Good. Thank
So,
you.
and now we're really going to have a discussion. And the reason why I don't agree is because the commercial pressure we're going to see from our customers, right? They're going to have to report on what's called Scope 1 emissions, which include fossil fuel. So even though you're a vessel owner and you are burning HFO and you have a lot of abatement technologies, you'll still need to report the combustion of Scope 1 emissions. So the abatement technologies that we're looking at is very much IMO stuff. It's not absolute emission savings unless you have changed the whole way you're calculating emissions in the industry. So I think the whole reporting structure that the companies on land is using is not compatible with what we're doing today, and that's why we have no other choice than change the fuel, because they're reporting on the direct emissions. So unless you can have a sensor and you can sense that this is happening, then you will still have to report on the emissions you burn.
Andreas, you represent the Scrubber Association. Do you have a comment back to that?
The abatement technology is not the answer to your question. I mean, when you're transiting from A to Z, obviously there will be a period of transition and you have to use every available method possible to reduce direct emissions. And that's abatement technology, that's where it comes in. And of course it will improve its operations, it will improve its efficiency, whatever that could be. You cannot though change the rules of the game while you play the game. I mean, the abatement technology now is part of Annex 6, and if you want to change it, then you have to change Annex 6. And I'm not going to go to that, but I do tend in this industry, the heavy fuel oil might still play a major role in the transitional period. But you have to reduce direct emissions. Possibly you can do carbon capturing. But if you stop, let's say, let's find by magic we have all ships working with different fuels. What are you going to do with the crude oil? That's my question. Where is it going to go? Because it has a use and the refineries will still working. But always my personal opinion was that if we try to achieve net zero, we have to go through periods, which one is the fuels we have today, they are the major fuels. Then suddenly we try to reduce the emissions by using abatement technology. Then we introduce slowly a mix, and then obviously a king will arrive from the mix. At the moment, I don't know if you agree with me on that, but I don't see any king or queen coming out of the mix. Everybody has his plus and minuses, and I am not sure if we can produce the quantities we want. That I don't have the statistics to say. I just thinking on my head, I don't think we can produce as much ammonia or blue hydrogen or that we need in the industry. So obviously we have to live with different fuels, and pre-openedly at the moment with the hydrocarbons that we have. Whether we go to the life cycle thing assessment is a different thing, but I think we have to go there because they keep saying, if my ship is net zero, then I'm done. But the gentleman over there, I agree with him, it's a global issue. It's not only on this vessel, it's not only on this car, it's not only on industry, it's all together. And I know, and we know very well, because one of the other things that I'm working with is just-in-time arrivals and departure from ports, and they're optimizing the port call. There are humongous companies or conglomerates, they want to control that. And if you don't do that correctly, then you have a problem. So the logistics comes in, and the supply chain comes in, and they will say in the future, I don't want to employ you, I want to take this company for this, and this reason, usually because you're sustainable, because you're green. We've seen that, we've seen adverts in certain conglomerates saying, I'm transiting my goods through this and that because they're sustainable, something like that.
So we have a Slido question. Do you see CO2 monitoring as a start for also in the future to document other types of gases like those from methanol and ammonia? So CO2 monitoring applicable to document other types of gases in the future.
I mean, if you, whatever fuel you have, if you produce CO2 and the problem is the greenhouse gas, then obviously you have to continue monitoring. And I believe that not in the near future, but soon enough, we may have more than one greenhouse gas. We haven't accepted anyone else, but we know that more than that. So my opinion, yes, you will monitor it. I think we've been skeptical of that.
Intermediate comments. So yeah, I think for sure because these methane slip and those are coming anyway to the regulations. So yes.
I think especially methane, because I believe the potency is 30 times stronger than CO2. So it is part of the greenhouse gas definition. So we will need to document and measure on methane especially. And ammonia, it doesn't have any carbon in it, but it has toxicity that is also important to keep track of.
And I think that raises an interesting point, and it really does go back to the development of standards and standardized methods so that we're comparing apples to apples. Because, you know, it's one of the flaws in the claims associated with LNG as a fuel at this point, is there hasn't been a standard or a procedure that everyone can use equally to measure methane slip. And you can make a claim that you reduce your CO2 by X by burning LNG, but if you don't factor in methane slip, the numbers don't mean anything. They're not real. And they're just paper gains. It's greenwashing. And that's not what we're trying to do here. And that's why we really need to, with each of these new fuels and each of these technologies, come up with really good measurement standards, as we discussed earlier today, and make sure that we're all playing by the same rules, we're all using the same criteria and the same data to achieve the goals, and making valid statements about our gains, and not make-believe statements and greenwashing ourselves. So I'm going to take just a couple of minutes for the last topic for this panel. We had a long presentation earlier today from Mia that was quite comprehensive about designing vessels for the future. And this path to net zero. And needless to say, you know, that's going to be a big piece of the puzzle of improving the efficiency of the ship itself. And not just what kind of fuel we burn, but the ship itself. And so I'd like to invite any comments, either from the floor or from the panel, as to the perspective about the importance of and the contribution of future ship design. And if you have any particular things that you're asking your builders to consider at this point in time to help you move down that path. Mia made some very good points about ship design. How far along that curve are we? Are you doing that? Are you working on your new builds and calculating in some of those new efficiencies from a design perspective? Is that happening? Is it real? Or is it just something we talk about in presentations?
Well, it depends. Some, especially for new buildings, some yards are flexible, some yards are not flexible. So if we are talking Japan, it's the rule book is carved in stone. But if you go in somewhere else, yes, there is flexibility. But my experience is that there is not so much knowledge. For example, we see all these new technologies with the sails and with the air lubrication system. Nobody knows, and they have not thought of this at design stage, most of the yards. So they don't offer it. They don't offer it. Yeah, so yeah, it depends actually.
Any other thoughts? Yeah.
As a naval architect by trade, obviously I will have to agree that the ship design is the most important part of this equation without any shadow of a doubt. However, I am surprised that on a day that's called Greece Green Day, and we're talking about reducing GHGs and alternative fuels that will lead to this outcome. There has been no mention, apart from my good friend over there, of the only fuel that is totally green, and that is nuclear. And in all these discussions that have been, I have never actually heard it being mentioned. And, you know, there is no greener fuel than nuclear power. In my opinion, if we are serious about net zero, it is the only solution. Now, what is the problem? There is no technological problem. The US Navy has been running nuclear surface vessels and submarines since 1953, the Royal Navy since 1960, with absolutely zero accidents, 100% safe. I know. The Russians, I've already discussed this, but you know, we're talking about different safety standards. Yes, I know that people will bring up Russian Navy accidents. That's why I didn't mention them. We're talking about proper training, proper maintenance, quality operation. So US, UK navies, no accidents. And the big issue is public perception, public opinion. I think that's where the problem lies, public opinion. What can we do as an industry to overcome the erroneous, in my humble opinion, public perception of nuclear-powered merchant vessels? And I was pleased to hear on a recent trip to Korea that in something in the middle of February this year, there was a big agreement with the two big players in Korea, Hyundai, Samsung, the Korea Atomic Energy Institute, and the Korean Nuclear Power, whatever they're called, and KR, Korean Register, that they are going to work on their own nuclear-powered commercial vessel designs. And we are talking about small nuclear reactors. We're not talking about the reactors that you will find on a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. You don't need this. You need very small nuclear reactors, as they're called, SNRs or MSRs, molten salt reactors, for up to a VLCC size. And these are not pressurized. So the safety perception, that's how you're going to overcome the indemnity issue. That, you know, a commercial vessel cannot obtain insurance if it's nuclear power today. But that is on the basis that your reactor is pressurized. And if something, God forbid, happens, it will be a catastrophic disaster. These small nuclear reactors are not pressurized. So the insurance issue is covered. So in my opinion, it is just public perception. And I'm surprised that it's not mentioned as an alternative fuel in all these green forums.
Great comment, thank you.
Thank you for your comment. The public perception, of course, is a very big element on the nuclear power. You can imagine the public perception for ship owners that will be burning heavy fuel oil in a few years. So you can imagine what would be this perception for the nuclear-powered ships. And knowing that the quality of the people that run ships is going down. I think we should all of us can tell that for sure. Why not having this technology, this great technology, the nuclear power, let's say build a plant in the middle of the ocean, generate e-fuels from electrolysis, and have a secure net around this, let's say, plant to produce cheap e-fuels that then will incentivize the owners to use them. Why not using this technology, this brilliant technology, this eco-technology in a safe manner that would also benefit the society and the shipping industry as well?
Interesting concept. And the molten salt reactors are discussed in these fora occasionally when we have the right participants. Thank you for bringing it up. I think over drinks last night, I said if I was going to put my money on a future technology 75 years from now, which I won't be around to see, it would be on the MSR. So we're just about out of time. I'd like to see if we have any closing comments from the panel, from the discussions that we've heard, or any last point that you would like to make. And wait a minute, we have another hand. 1 second, please. Sorry, I missed you.
We talked about ship designs, and more or less the consensus is that the shipyards will not build a bigger ship. In 2010, the EU initiated a project called Ulysses. And the objective of the project is to see if by operating larger vessels, the VLCC size was doubled from 300 to 550 and with slower speed. And the result was that with a bigger ship and slower speed, you can reduce straight away emissions by more than 50%. And then the discussion was initiated, okay, where can you unload a 550,000 VLCC? And most of the port operators, they said, not in my port. So if we want to talk about reduction of emissions from shipping, we have to think about new designs. I don't know why the VLCC since the 70s is 330 meters long and 58 or 60 meters beam. We have to think about new designs, but to do that we need the cooperation of states, governments and ports.
Thank you so much. Great point. Mia?
Yeah, I was just thinking to kind of say like a final note to this last topic about the ship design, and so and yeah, especially about the kind of if the shipyards, what are they willing to build and so on. So I think there, of course, one solution is that there needs to be this strong design, and then owner needs to take it to the yard and demand that it's built like that, and how to know those technologies. So it is always like, because we have been dealing with this, of course, a lot, building new technologies, new fuels, and especially with new ones, if nobody has had them ever, so then it actually needs to be it's kind of, to me, of course, as a designer, so kind of I don't know, sales pitch, but the fact is that if putting effort more probably actually than nowadays to the conceptual design phase, so at least what I see in our designs, so those simulations for those concepts that we make, so they actually are also realized, so they start to be pretty reliable, and then of course it's always possibility to make that more accurate in the basic design phase. So that gives the confidence that which technology actually we should push for those designs. So really I would say that putting more effort in those simulations, they start to be actually pretty accurate, and then also when the ship is actually built, kind of then taking that data and looking that are we actually performing. We are today kind of, it's not like some process that I could say that yeah, we do this the same way every time, but at least, you know, those big things, the hull performance, the machinery performance, those technology performance, it can be anyway, we can separate it from the data and we can validate. So I would say that it's really this digital path, you know, from the start to the end, validating. So to me there, like the digital twin, okay, maybe in operation it's also nice, but really I think that is one solution also, that kind of really making that good design, strong design, and then believing it's enough to actually then kind of push it to the shipyards. So yeah, let's more with the drinks then.
So we've covered a lot of territory. I think we've talked about things in a circle somewhat because we're in a circle. I mean, all of these things are so interconnected. We've talked about the future vessels. I want to ask one final question to all of you before we close the room. I asked about one practical step that we can take forward, and Rasmus' answer was about digitalization, basically, and documentation and moving things forward with data. How many of you in the room have ever employed the use of what we were talking about earlier in terms of digital twins to look at optimization of your existing vessels, forgetting about new buildings? Can you raise your hand if you've employed digital twin technology? Okay, a few, but not a lot. I think this is another very practical step that we can take to start to model the behavior of our ships, looking at historical data and using different integration of platforms for route optimization and weather optimization, and looking at sometimes a propeller pitch or a rudder angle can make a significant difference in changing environments in the same route over and over again. And I think they're getting really good at developing these baseline performance monitoring so that when you deviate from the baseline, your algorithm is actually recommending to you what measures to take to try to stay within the baseline of optimization. So I think it's just another thing in the digital world that we've talked about today that we ought to start thinking a little bit more about from a practical step. And I know that many owners around the world are already employing these platforms, but I think it's another very, very positive and immediate step we can take. It's not something in the future that we don't know anything about. It's something that is real today, and it can make a very significant difference and give us real results, measurable results. So I would like to again thank all of you. It's really been my pleasure for the course of the day to be in the position to be your moderator and to encourage these discussions and challenge you and make outlandish statements to see if I can rile you up. Thank you for the opportunity to do that, and thank you so much for all of your kind participation. Thank you again to our panel, if we could give them a hand. And I think, yes, I think Klaus has gone for the magic bowl to do the drawing. So at this point, again, I would like to thank you. I wish you all safe travels back to your homes, your offices, or wherever you might be going. It's been my pleasure to be with you today. I get better for it every time I have the chance to be in a new environment like this. So it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you, Klaus, for the kind invitation for me to participate. And at this point, I would like to hand it back over to Klaus so we can do the drawing and then go enjoy the cocktail reception. So thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you, John, for the kind words, and especially thank you for your strong drive of this event we had here today. It's highly appreciated. Just on behalf of the host today, the facilitators, Fraser, Company Fraser, Houghton, and Green Instruments, we'd like to thank you all for showing up today, and also for acknowledging our invitations and out to join this event. We want to thank you, our two agents, Company Friendman, Company Deltamarin, for sharing the local network here. As I would say that the Greece marine market is a foreign land for most of our companies here, so it has been a huge benefit and value for us to having you to join this event, so we can build up and strengthen our local network here with the aim of bringing added value to you and your operation. A special thanks to Andreas, to Mia, to Rasmus for taking the time to join this event. We have had some very strong panel discussions here and touching base on some very important topics. We could go on for hours here because it's actually very valuable to share our mindset and also for you to opening up your mindset and your thoughts about operating vessels going forward. As Rasmus shared this also, and I think also you did, Andreas, this for the previous slide, there's a long way to go for the path to net zero. Nuclear could be one of the paths to follow, but then again, the transition from going from fossil fuels to other compliant fuels, greener fuels, into a net zero fuel operation, it's decades ahead. So thank you to all of you for showing up and supporting this. And also the reason for why we all gathered here, the competition. So we will need a goddess of luck. Mia, if you could support us. Should we show the prize first here? It has been out at the desk besides the ball. It's a Danish design, a stainless steel jug. The couple jug, designed by a famous Danish brand, Georg Jensen, which we believe will suit in more or less any home on a daily base use, or when you have VIP guests or whatsoever. So, Mia, if you could take your dress and drag it up over your head without...
Come on!
See. No, just...
maybe a little bit more tricks.
Now with closed eyes, just toss around in the jug. Me too.
No, I'm not really sure. Should I really punch you or like... what should I do?
Whatever.
Vote for that.
Whatever. No, that's mine. Oh, we have a yellow business card here. Easy recognized. And the winner of our gift here is Mr. Kyriakos from Levante Ferries. If you could come up here, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, and finally, again, thank you to all of you. Cocktails just outside the door here. Thank you.